survey approach, more of a theological survey of the book of Samuel. You're making it difficult for me sitting on every possible side of the room, but that's y'all's way. You like to be difficult sheep. You could all like sit right here like good students, but only three of you know that the students who sit on the front two rows always make the best grades. All right. But you obstinate back row folk, if we were giving grades, I would fail you simply because you sit on the back row. But we're going to go through the book of Samuel. I've given to you, I don't have a handout for you, so accept my apologies, and a poor substitute is what I have written on the whiteboard. These are, in one sense, ways that I think make the book of Samuel easy to sort of put into a seed form, so that if you study it in more detail, it can kind of like, like popcorn, it can sort of expand and you'll see more and more of the contours that the book of Samuel has. Let's cover some of the questions that we raise when we turn our attention to any book of the Bible. We ask a question about who wrote this book, when was it written, where was it written, and we've seen repeatedly in the Old Testament that we don't find explicit answers in the text itself about authorship. That is the same for the book of Samuel. So we don't know who wrote the book of Samuel. Some people think that there might be some evidence that since it is written, since it is placed into the section of the Hebrew Bible called the prophets, that maybe it was one of the later prophets. One Old Testament scholar I read said maybe Ehud. But the point being, we do not know. So don't know who the author is. He doesn't identify himself in the book. But since Samuel comes to die in this book, we know that it was not Samuel. So that's what we can say definitively. We do know that the book of Samuel, which we call 1st and 2nd Samuel, in Hebrew was written as one book. The reason that it is divided into two is when the Old Testament was being translated into Greek, they put it into two different books. And thus it has come to us primarily through the Greek translation of the Old Testament as 1st and 2nd Samuel. For this reason, we will not study it as 1st and 2nd Samuel. We will study it as Samuel, and we'll use the 1st and 2nd just to denote where it is we're making breaks in how we organize what the book is teaching us. The events of 1st Samuel seem to occur around 1100 BC, while the events around 2nd Samuel seem to be around the 970s BC. So that's the age of the events. Authorship seems to be later, but again, if you don't know the author, it's a little difficult to be able to say when was it written. I teach a New Testament class at a Christian school my kids go to in Jacksonville, and I was reading in James Hamilton's book. It's a biblical theology of the whole Bible, and I was reading in Luke, and there he was explaining that Luke is very similar to Samuel, and I've not read that before. And one of the ways that you can see the title of 1 Samuel I have given you here is what? The Rise of a King. Sounds like a good movie. Oh, there actually is. I don't know who it is. Is it Netflix or Amazon? They've done a little series called David, and it uses information from Samuel for part of that series, and it is absolutely riveting to follow the story of the rise of the king. But in the Gospel of Luke, when you see Luke and Acts as two volumes that Luke wrote, you find some parallels that Luke's gospel in the book of Acts could be the Gospel of Luke could be titled The Rise of the King, and Acts could be called The Reign of the King or The Triumph of the King. And Samuel works in the same way. So if you wonder what might be the most simple summary of Samuel, and it makes for a good movie, all right, The Rise of the King. The Rise of the King. So you remember in Judges, who were the leaders that we saw God raise up in the book of Judges? It's not a trick question. Judges. Who do you think is going to start off in Samuel as the leadership office in Samuel? Judges. Not a trick question either. But we're going to see in Samuel that we go all the way from a judge, and that is the last judge, over to what we will find the Lord's king, which in one sense we'll be able to understand that because of what will happen in the book of Samuel, we find that since this is the Lord's king, we'll find that from him comes the last king. So king might be a very effective way for you to think the book of Samuel is about the rise and the reign of King David. So, but for shorthand, the rise of the king. I gave to you a three-part division of the book of Samuel. There's a number of helpful divisions. The ones that I have looked at in different Old Testament commentators, I find them all very persuasive, but I've given to you the simplest. I tend to like the shortest, most fewest divisions in a book. I'm always attracted to that kind of breakdown. And so the breakdown that I give to you suggests that you might sort of get it around your mind so that you could kind of have a mental map of the message of Samuel is the last judge. That's the first eight chapters in 1 Samuel. The first king, that's chapters 9 through 15 in 1 Samuel. And then the Lord's king, 1 Samuel 16 through 2 Samuel 24. One of the things that we noted as we have been going through the Old Testament is the way in which the Old Testament authors put together their books are sometimes different than the way we may prefer a book to be read and interpreted. We saw in the Torah what was a significant device that Moses used. There are 5 major ones that he used to in one sense, accent and connect major portions of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. An example is Exodus 15. Psalms. All right, Psalms. All right, or a poem, a song. And all right, so in that sense, poems, in this case, it is the Song of Moses. Those are one of the devices, especially in narrative books in the Old Testament, that when you find a poem in a narrative, you need to realize this is significant. And when it comes to the book of Samuel, we are able to see that there are 3 poems that kind of have that binding or hinge effect in the book of Samuel. The first comes in chapter 2 of 1 Samuel. The second comes in chapter 1 of 2 Samuel. And the third comes in chapter 22 and 23 in 2 Samuel. Those are going to be critical as we seek to connect what the book of Samuel teaches us. In one sense, we're going to especially accent what we see in the first poem, which is from Hannah, and then what we see in David's poem, which concludes or is the concluding poem in Samuel. Now, there are some points I'm just going to give to these so you can kind of know these are major themes that are developed in the book of Samuel. These, in one sense, become themes that are not unique to Samuel, but they then begin to find greater and greater. We'll call them they're like a thread, if you will, that will be weaved throughout the rest of the scripture. So another thing about Samuel that's helpful to understand is what is going to happen in Samuel is going to have reverberating, didn't say that very well, but it's going to have effects that emanate out from Samuel through the rest of the Hebrew Bible. So it's a very, very important book. And some of these accent points you'll be able to pick up, and the prophets especially will pick these up as well, or the latter prophets. The reversal of the world's values. We're going to see that as a theme in Samuel. The reversal of the world's values. Another theme that Samuel will teach us is the replacement with the Lord's choices. So it's not only what we'll see God is against, we also see what God is for. Another theme that is developed in the book of Samuel is that this contrast between the mighty and the handsome, with the small and the weak. And then another development that arises is we see the establishment of God's forever king. This will be explicitly called the establishing the Davidic covenant. This will also, unfortunately, show us that David's sin, or the sin of the king, has horrific consequences on the kingdom, which leads us to say, in a more broad sense, the remaining consequences of the sins of God's people in contrast with God's faithfulness to mercy according to the covenant. One thing that we're going to start with is we're going to look at location. All right, I think I have written for you, there's more of this, but one of the things that you can do in Samuel is you begin to notice how there is going to be its movement. So geographically and genealogically, we have seen those are two twin tracks that the Old Testament has been developing God's redemptive promises. And we're going to see this Sunday, or not this Sunday, but soon, Sunday. The promise in Genesis 3:15 gives our hope to be riveted to what? A seed, which is to say a son born of woman. So we have this beginning kind of pregnant, literally pregnant paradigm for what we're looking for when it comes to how is God going to change what Adam lost in the garden. And then immediately, we've already seen that at the very end, Adam names his wife Eve, which means the mother of all the living, which means he has a hope for a seed to come from woman. Well, immediately in chapter 4, we're going to be introduced to who's the firstborn? Cain. And he has a younger brother, Abel. And the hopes of Adam and Eve are pinned to Cain. And yet, what does Cain do? He sins and he kills his brother and is cursed by God. And so this kind of expectation for a one to come genealogy. Which son is it? Which line will it be? It started in the very beginning, and then we've seen as it came to Noah, out of his 3 sons, one was cursed. Now we've seen all of the people who inhabit the land of Canaan. From which son of Noah do they come from? The cursed or the blessed sons? The cursed sons. So in one sense, they had it coming to them, not only because of their own evil deeds and idolatry, but also because they were a descendant of that son of Noah, whom Noah cursed. When we got to the end of Genesis, you may also remember in Genesis 49, Jacob gives a blessing to his sons. And we find not all of those sons' blessings were actually blessings. Some of them were curses. But one son was given a special a special blessing. It was the tribe of Judah. And in verses 8 through 10, we'll see that come up in the book of Samuel. That we already know that there is indeed a seed from the woman who will crush the serpent's head. We will see that this one is actually coming from the tribe of Judah. And that one is going to be a defeating warrior king who will have the scepter, a symbol of his reign, that will never pass from his hand. So it's an eternal kingship. All of those, in one sense, in conjunction with the Abrahamic covenant, all come crashing into Samuel. So it's hard to overemphasize the importance of the book of Samuel. So genealogy is something that we're going to be seeing to be a major aspect of what develops in Samuel. The other track is geography. Geography. Thus far, we've been centering our geography on two main places. One, they had an exile from Eden, but they were moving toward where? God's the people that God makes relationships with. First, we saw it was Adam and Eden. And then we see God eventually chooses Abraham and makes a promise to him that he is going to have many descendants and he's going to give them a land. We eventually learned that that land is actually called Canaan. And we have been traveling with Israel through with Moses and then with Joshua to actually enter into Canaan. So we've had this land issue the whole time we've been in the Old Testament, but we've primarily been focused upon the land of Canaan. Now geography is going to have a more narrow focus. And we start out in Shiloh. And there you may remember is where the ark was. This is where worship was temporarily located for. This is where the tabernacle was established at the end of the Judges. And in the beginning of Samuel, we start in Shiloh, but in the end of Samuel, where do you think we end up? Jerusalem. All right. So Samuel is incredibly significant because it takes us from a temporary location of the worship of Yahweh by his people in Shiloh to the permanent location of the worship of Yahweh in Jerusalem through the temple. So you will probably recognize that is massively significant to understand God's redemptive work in the world. The book of Samuel takes us on that geographical journey. Well, first let's look at the last judge. We are introduced to him at the very beginning. Now there was a certain man from, and I butcher that name every time, so I'm just going to Ramathaim Zophim from the hill country of Ephraim, and his name was Elkanah, the son of Jeroham, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, an Ephraimite. And he had two wives. I wrote up there Elah, but his name is not Elah. So it's, but he is a judge, but he is also functioning as a priest. And we see that he has two wives. Now, one of the things that we see in verse 3 is his location is in Shiloh. And he has two sons, Eli, Hophni, and the two sons of Eli were Hophni and Phinehas. They were priests to Yahweh there. One of the threads that I'm not going to develop is pay attention to fathers and their sons in the book of Samuel. It is not a good story, right? When you see the way in which sons behave in the book of Samuel, it gives to us great concern and emphasis for the role of fathers and their sons. But it's also teaching us something about the son that eventually will come. But we're able to see they're in Shiloh, and we start with these priests. And we see that the priest Elkanah sacrificed, and he would give portions to his two wives and all her sons. Verse 5, but to Hannah he would give a double portion, for he loved Hannah, but Yahweh had closed her womb. So you have two wives of one man, a priest. And which wife is the powerful wife in that sense? Which wife has more going for her in the world? That's right. So one of the things that it really has been true up until relatively recently, if you did not give forth children, and especially sons, you left your whole family very, very open for ruin. So giving birth was central to a wife's, in one sense, contribution to the family, but especially giving sons. And so here we begin with this one wife, Peninnah. I know that's not how you say it, Peninnah. And she is the one who she has the children and she is getting the portion. And then you find the weaker, the infertile one, Hannah. But Hannah is favored by her husband and he loves her. Well, she has need, and so she comes and she goes up to the house of Yahweh and she is worshiping and she is crying out, and so she offers a prayer. We see the prayer that she makes in verse 11, and it includes, but will you give your maidservant a seed amongst men? Then I will give him to Yahweh all the days of his life, and a razor shall never come on his head. Now, at this point, we're able to see that she is saying that she is asking God to give her a seed, and we have the expectations for what that may mean because of the way seed is being developed through God's redemptive covenant promises. But here we see she will give him back to the Lord. He will be dedicated to the Lord. And so this is her petition that she brings before God as she is worshiping Yahweh at the tabernacle. And so that you go through, and there's obviously some confusion about how she's behaving in that situation, but God hears her prayer and God gives to her a son. And then we see in verse 24 that she weaned him, she took him up with her, and a 3-year-old bull and 1 ephah of flour and a jug of wine, and brought him to the house of Yahweh in Shiloh, although the boy was young. And then they slaughtered the bull and brought the young boy to Eli. And she said, O Lord, as your soul lives, my Lord, I am the woman who stood here beside you praying to Yahweh. For this young boy I prayed, and Yahweh has given me my petition, which I asked of him. So I have also dedicated him to Yahweh. As long as he lives, he is dedicated to Yahweh. So he worshiped Yahweh there. Now, stop. What does this reveal? Though she was weak, though she was despised, what was her heart like toward Yahweh? She was trusting. So we're going to learn that indeed, Eli is not a great priest. But this particular woman is the ideal. She is the one who relates with a certain kind of heart toward Yahweh, and Yahweh hears her prayer. And though she is weak in the world, Yahweh prefers her over the other wife who was strong according to the world's estimation. And so now in chapter 2, Hannah offers a prayer, and this is where there is incredible significance in Hannah's prayer that is not just exemplary in how we might give praise to God for God answering our prayer, but it's very unique what she comes to say. First, her heart exults in Yahweh. My horn is exalted in Yahweh. Now, what's interesting, as we turn over and we'll look at 2 Samuel chapter 22, we will see multiple times that this is exactly the same language that David will use. But then we're able to see she contrasts herself against her enemies. My mouth speaks boldly against my enemies because I am glad in your salvation. So this prayer of thanksgiving is in one sense understood to be a response of God's salvation. That God giving her this son is God saving her from her enemies. I take it her competing wife. And he has removed in one sense the threats that were against her. And then she says, there is no one holy like Yahweh. Indeed, there is no one besides you. Nor is there any rock like our God. Do not multiply, speaking so very proudly. Let arrogance not come out of your mouth, for Yahweh is a God of knowledge, and with him actions are weighed. The bows of the mighty are shattered, but those who stumble gird on strength. Those who are full hire themselves out for bread, but those who are hungry cease to hunger. Even the barren gives birth to 7, but she who has many children languishes. Yahweh puts to death and makes alive. He brings down to Sheol and raises up. Yahweh makes poor and rich. He brings low. He also exalts. He raises the poor from the dust. He exalts the needy from the ash heap to make them sit with nobles and inherit a seat of glory. For the pillars of the earth are Yahweh's, and he set the world on them. Now stop there. What does Hannah in this prayer of thanksgiving say about God's working in the world? How does God work and what is he doing? Okay, he is sovereign.
He favors the weak and
That's right. And what does he do to them?
raises them up.
That's right. Right. And this is all framed in one sense to Yahweh's salvation in response to Hannah's disposition towards Yahweh, manifest in her prayer and his answer. Look at verse 9. He keeps the feet of his holy ones, but the wicked ones are silenced in darkness. For not by power shall man prevail. Those who contend with Yahweh will be dismayed. Against them he will thunder in the heavens. Yahweh will render justice to the ends of the earth, and he will give strength to his king, and he will exalt the horn of his anointed. Now, at this point, you say, how did a mother move from giving thanksgiving to God for answering her prayer for a son to where at the very end, what is she saying Yahweh will do?
Justice. King. Like there's going to be a king.
All right. So Yahweh's going to give strength through his king, and Yahweh is going to render justice. But how far will Yahweh bring justice?
The ends of the earth.
Where is Hannah praying? Shiloh. In one sense, if Hannah was only operating according to the Mosaic covenant, and if you think about her geographical thinking about Yahweh's glory and what he would do, where would be the borders of Yahweh's glory in the Mosaic covenant? In Canaan. Is that where the borders of Hannah's expectation for Yahweh's glory end? No. It actually extends to the whole world. That Yahweh is going to render justice to the ends of the earth, and he will give strength to his king, and he will exalt the horn of his anointed. So now Hannah seems to be prophesying. She seems to be foretelling that which we're going to see through the rest of the book of Samuel. It actually comes to fulfillment. So you're going to now flip all the way over to 2 Samuel chapter 22. Now, 2 Samuel chapter 22 is really long, so we're not going to be reading it all. But here, what we're able to see is David has arisen to not only be anointed as the king, but actually to become king in Israel. He conquers all of the enemies, and we're able to read at the very end of chapter 21 that he went to war with the Philistines, and there were even giants in Gath, but they fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants. Now, this will be helpful. We're not going to have time to get into it, but if we could go into the narrative of David killing Goliath, and here we see even reference in verse 22 at the end of chapter 21 of 2 Samuel. Accent, emphasis, attention is given to how does David kill Goliath, that, if you will, that great evil beast. And how does David, in this case, when it comes to the giants in Gath, how are they defeated? This is not a trick question. It's by his hand. All right? The promise of Genesis 3:15. There is another great serpent, that is going to fall. And how is the great serpent going to fall? A blow from the seed of the woman. So it's not an accident that we're going to see that indeed, as David is rising to be the Lord's king, he actually is doing the things that we have been given expectations to see: the anointed one, this deliverer, this king who will defeat the serpent. David is the one who by his hand is bringing down in one sense, the great evil beast that opposed the Lord and his people. And so that's the way it ends in chapter 21. And God has given salvation to Israel through his favor of David's work. And so in chapter 22, David now has a song. And we are going to look at some of the song that David gave to Yahweh from the hand of all of his enemies, from the hand of Saul. One, we see in verse 2, he begins with similar language that we saw Hannah refer to Yahweh as. Yahweh is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer. My God, my rock in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold and my refuge, my Savior, you save me from violence. That's exactly how Hannah began her prayer. That her prayer of thanksgiving was a response to Yahweh's salvation. As we go through it, we're able to see that David's heart before the Lord, his disposition before Yahweh, is in one sense an accent of the way in which he relates to God. So giving us evidence, and we'll look into this as we get into the Davidic covenant, what kind of person was David in relationship to Yahweh? What's that? Okay. It's true he was his anointed. It is also true that he was sinful. But that's not the accent that we'll get about David in Samuel. All right. Yes, he becomes king, but in disposition toward Yahweh. Okay. What, Tim? Yeah, he has a heart after God. Just like Hannah had a disposition or a heart that was trusting of God, calling out to God, believing God. So you have David has the same kind of disposition towards Yahweh. So David, though, yes, a king, yes, anointed, but yet what was his disposition towards God? It was his heart towards God that was the accent mark of why was David favored? Why is David the Lord's king? Why was David the instrument of salvation? It was because of his heart toward God. See, the Old Testament teaches us this. The issue of the heart in relationship to God is not invented in the New Testament. It is an Old Testament accent mark about those whom God favors, God saves, God hears, God delivers. And it's not their position in the world that God looks at, but rather it is their heart toward him. So we see this in Hannah, we see this in David. And so he is giving Yahweh praise for his salvation, but he indeed says Yahweh is the one in whom he takes refuge. Go to verse 47. Again, he uses the language of Yahweh as his rock. Let the God of the rock of my salvation be lifted high, the God who executes vengeance for me and brings down people under me, who brings me out from my enemies. You even lift me above those who rise up against me. You rescue me from the violent man. So who is actually doing the fighting and the winning and the subduing of his enemies in David's military pursuits? It is Yahweh. Just like with Hannah, who actually exalted Hannah above her enemies? Yahweh. So the response in verse 50, therefore I will give thanks to you, O Yahweh, among the nations, and I will sing praises to your name. He gives great salvation to his king and shows loving kindness to his anointed. Now here's the kicker, to David and to his seed forever. So the conclusion of David's psalm in chapter 22, does it terminate with David? No. Now we're going to go back and we're going to look at what is called one of the most important chapters in the Hebrew Bible, 2 Samuel chapter 7. But we're able to see that in the Psalm of Thanksgiving, or the poem of thanksgiving that David gives in response to Yahweh's salvation, which indeed has him king, it has him exalted over his enemies, that the way in which David ends is that God's loving kindness, who's reading the ESV? How does the ESV render verse 51? And shows what?
22 or 23?
22, verse 51.
Great salvation brings the steadfast love.
Steadfast love. I think the ESV, I don't know if they put this in the beginning of the translation notes, but they will use that word to indicate the translation of the important Hebrew word chesed, which is God's covenant love. It is only this love that God gives to his redeemed people. So David knows and expresses it here that God's covenant love for David, which we're going to go back in just a second and see that it was made in the Davidic covenant to the anointed one, it did not end with David. David himself says that Yahweh will show this covenant love to his seed. How long? Forever. So is David thinking of a temporal a kingdom that sort of only terminated with either David's reign or Solomon's reign? No. David's understanding of the Davidic covenant manifest here is that it was forever. And its marker was not necessarily the son, but rather the steadfast love of God who made that covenant with David. That's important. So we see in 23, the poem does, it starts another section. And here we see, I want you to look, he starts in the beginning of verse 3. God is his rock again of Israel. But when you look down to verse 5, truly is not my house so with God, for he has made an everlasting covenant with me, ordered in all things and secured for all my salvation and all my desire will he not indeed make it grow. Now this word grow is going to be an important connecting word when we move on to the prophets who will take up comments, theological explanation. Because you do remember, what is the expectation to come from the root of Jesse? Yeah, we're going to see the prophet Isaiah is going to accent that there is going to be a judgment that will come to Israel. And in that sense, if you imagine Israel to be a tree, it will be cut down, but there will be a stump. And something's going to grow from that stump. And it's going to be this root of Jesse. Here, David himself says, will he, that is Yahweh, not indeed make it grow, referring to the covenant that he made with David, that there will be a king who will rise up from the house of Judah, which indeed now has trickled down not just to the house of Judah, now we think to the house of David. And David's confidence as he's looking to the future is that Yahweh will do this. And then in verses 6 and 7, but vile men, every one of them, will be thrust away like thorns because they cannot be taken in hand. But the man who touches them must be armed with iron and the shaft of a spear, and they will be completely burned with fire where they sit. So here we're able to see that David is moving, in one sense, to understand what God's covenant with him, we'll double back and quickly cover one of the most important chapters in the Hebrew Bible, that this is not a covenant that terminates with himself and with his kingdom, but rather it will never end. And the banknote, if you will, that guarantees that this promise will be fulfilled and there will be an eternal king from the house of David who will reign over all nations is God's covenant faithfulness. God's covenant faithfulness. Now, if we see that both Hannah and David bring together Abrahamic covenant promises, that indeed there is one who is a descendant from Abraham, and this one is going to bring a blessing to all the nations. Hannah said that, and David has also said that. Well, that was a part of the Abrahamic covenant in Genesis 13. Therefore, what we have happening is we see even David himself in this poem reflect on the covenant God has made with him, that they're seeing that the Abrahamic covenant and the Davidic covenant, they, in one sense, they come together here. You can imagine them in one sense like two ropes that now are braided together. And what we don't find here is the Mosaic covenant. That there is an expectation for the future that God is going to be steadfast in his faithfulness to the Abrahamic covenant and to the Davidic covenant that is going to bring forth a seed of Abraham and a son of David who will reign over all nations, over all the earth as this king and bring salvation to God's people. How do you think the New Testament begins? The opening verse in the New Testament, turn there, Matthew chapter 1, verse 1. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Samuel, the book of Samuel, shows us that indeed what God does by exalting those like Hannah and David is bringing forth ultimately in its fulfillment in Jesus Christ the salvation that God has promised according to these two covenants. Now, this requires that we go back, and I want you to turn to chapter 7 of 2 Samuel. And this is, I took this not from a dispensational theologian. I'm not sure what Stephen Dempster is, but I do think he is not dispensational. And he himself writes, quote, "This is one of the most important chapters in the entire Hebrew Bible." That here in 2 Samuel chapter 7, geography and genealogy merge with David and Jerusalem, because from now on, after 2 Samuel chapter 7, we learn that it's going to be from one person and one place that blessing will flow to Israel and all nations. And here in 2 Samuel, it's chapter 7, it begins, the beginning, verse 7, the first 7 verses, David looks at his palace and reasons this way: I am the king of Israel, and I have this great house. I should build for the divine king of Israel, Yahweh, a house for him. He consults with Nathan the prophet, which it might help us to realize, how did prophets function? Kings would have had prophets as like a part of their court. They would have been counselors. And so David consults Nathan, that faithful prophet. Nathan agrees. There's one big problem. God does not agree. God does not agree that David has a good plan, and he does not agree that Nathan agreed with David's plan. And so God reveals to Nathan that he is not for David's plan. And he tells Nathan what needs to be told to David. Verse 8, "So now thus you shall say to my servant David, thus says Yahweh of hosts, I myself took you from the pasture, from following the sheep, to be ruler over my people. I have been with you wherever you have gone, and have cut off all your enemies from before you, and I will make you a great name, like the name of the great men who are on the earth. And I will appoint a place for my people Israel and will plant them, that they may dwell in their own place and not be disturbed again, and the unrighteous will not afflict them any more as formerly, even from the day I commanded judges to be over my people Israel. And I will give you rest from all your enemies. Yahweh also declares to you that Yahweh will make a house for you. When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up one of your seed after you, who will come forth from your own body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be a father to him, and he will be a son to me. When he commits iniquity, I will reprove him with the rod of men and with the stripes from the sons of men. But my loving kindness shall not be removed from him, as I removed it from Saul, whom I removed before you. And your house and your kingdom shall endure before me forever, and your throne shall be established forever. According to all these words, and according to all this vision, so Nathan spoke to David. So here we find out that no, God will not let David build a house for him. Yahweh will build a house for David. Now, the word house here is a beautiful word that helps us to see there are two components that are a part of the singular word house, just like you use the word house, right? I hope Lily will one day soon be able, isn't your brother-in-law's name Sean? Sorry, Josh. All right. Josh will one day say to Lily, "Come, Lily, come and sit at the table of my house." Now, he literally probably means that he has a physical building and a single location, and you could mail him letters there, and it's a table in that literal house. But he also means, when he says that to her, that you're actually coming to me as one of my own. This is my family. So house here means a literal place, and it also means dynasty. So it's both geography and genealogy, all tied up in the covenant that we call the Davidic covenant. God is the one who will build this dynasty and a house from David's son. And God makes this covenant, and yet God is the only one who can keep this covenant. God is the one who is acting like the father, and David is the one who is his son. And this house is the key for Israel's redemption, but not only for Israel's redemption, all the nations' redemption as well. We're also able to see that what is going to happen to David's sons in this covenant if they sin. In verse 14. All right. This is one reason that we know, is this covenant only fulfilled in Jesus Christ? Jesus didn't sin. So, right. Therefore, this is one of the places that I think the Bible necessitates what is called multiple fulfillment. That verse 14 is fulfilled in Solomon. And indeed, Solomon was corrected by God for his sins. But it also enables us to see, does the disqualification, so to speak, of the sons of David in verse 14 cancel out the Davidic covenant? That God will make from David's seed, David's line, a king who will reign forever, a throne that will be established forever. That's right. No, because verse 15 then says, "But my loving kindness shall not be removed from him, as I removed it from Saul, whom I removed from before you. And your house and your kingdom shall endure before me forever. Your throne will be established forever." Verse 15 anchors the fulfillment of this covenant in God's loving kindness, in God's chesed. Just like David in the poem ended with, "Who has God's chesed been given to? David and his seed. Now, this is indeed ultimately fulfilled in Jesus Christ. But we're able to see that the Davidic covenant, unlike the Mosaic covenant or the Sinaitic covenant, the Davidic covenant is grounded in God's steadfast love to the covenant. It's not going to be canceled, even though David will have sons who sin. God will chastise them, but his steadfast love is what will ensure that this covenant will be fulfilled. That makes this a unilateral covenant, that it is conditioned upon God's steadfast love for it to be fulfilled. So, in that sense, can anything thwart this covenant promise? Nothing. Nothing. God will correct David's sons, but fulfillment of this promise indeed is based upon God's steadfast love made in the covenant to David, which is indeed why we will not find in the Hebrew Bible a good page where Israel in any way merits God's fulfillment to this covenant promise. And yet we will find God fulfills this very covenant promise in Jesus Christ. The rest of the Hebrew Bible is now concerned with this particular seed and this particular place. David and his seed, Jerusalem and its temple, now becomes the central occupation of the Hebrew Bible. Not because it was, in that sense, the particular place, but rather the place as it pertains to the covenant. We also see that as Abraham entered into this unilateral covenant, so David also enters into a covenant that God has guaranteed by his own character. As we see, David now will make it very clear that his hope, as we saw in the poem, his hope rests in God's steadfast love and the son that would come in the future. Very quickly, however, and we'll just sort of hit the high points. Very quickly, we have now this hope that is riveted to a son of David, that it's grounded, if you will, upon the character of God that is manifest in the covenant promises. But we've already seen so far sons of God, Adam, Israel. How have they responded? We've sort of had hopes. And what happens with each one of those prior sons of God as God brings them to a new place? They fail. Immediately after this, in chapters 11 and 12, we see that David fails greatly with the sin with Bathsheba, but especially with having Uriah's blood on his hands. And in one sense, I want you to jump over to the back of 2 Samuel. It may be at the end of 2 Samuel, when we read at the end of chapter 23, the last person listed in the account of who were David's mighty men is Uriah the Hittite. Now, one commentator that I read said, it seems that this is given to us as a reader so that we remember David as not this perfect man, but a man who had blood on his hands. And it was, in that sense, a great sinner. David is not this promised king. David is, however, the king who did have a heart after God and whom God made this promise to. David, then we find in chapter 11 and 12, he commits the sin. Chapter 12, go back to chapter 12, God visits David and Bathsheba for David's sin and the child who she carried from adultery committed dies. But in verse 24 of chapter 12, David and his wife Bathsheba, she now gives birth to a son, and he, that is David, named him Solomon, And what are we told about Yahweh and Solomon?
We loved
And Nathan gave him another name. What is the name that Nathan, verse 25, gave Solomon? Jedediah, which means Yahweh loved him. So here we're able to see, kind of go back to Hannah. The last wife that we are given in the Hebrew Bible regarding David is Bathsheba. Now, if you were going to select from David's wives, which one would most likely be the wife who would give him a son, whom this son Yahweh will love, and this son will be the anointed one to follow David in the kingdom? You'd probably choose Abigail, right? But you probably wouldn't choose Bathsheba. And yet, who did God choose? Bathsheba's son. We see, again, this constant theme in Samuel that will continue throughout Scripture. God is choosing the least. God is choosing the low. God is choosing the weak. And he is establishing them. And so we see that indeed with Solomon. Chapters 12 through 13 takes us through. It's incredibly difficult to read if you're imagining that Israel is a righteous lot. You go through the elimination of all the other royal sons. And in chapters 21 through 24, we see that David arises up from being the anointed king. Indeed, in that sense, the one prophesied by Hannah, who will bring a new order to the world, a new order to Israel. We see David arise as also becoming the one that Yahweh delivers in a way that Yahweh delivered Moses. In chapter 22, we see that David is delivered so that God delivers Israel. And we also see that David is praising God for his covenant faithfulness. So in that sense, the relationship that we see David especially accent is not a works relationship, but rather one that is based upon God's faithfulness to covenant promises. But David also develops in the rise of the king in these chapters from 21 to 24. We see that David indeed is this warrior king who brings salvation for God's people, but as he is empowered by God. So the hope of Israel is in this rising king empowered by God, who is David. So in chapter 23, David is called the Messiah in verse 1. And in that sense, he becomes like Adam in verses 2 and 3. He reigns or rules over all people. But in chapter 23, verse 5, we see how far David himself knows that he misses the mark. And so we indeed see David is a great sinner. But though he was a great sinner, David does not seem to lose permanently this disposition before God for who he really is, and to have this trusting, believing, humble heart before God. In chapter 24, we're able to see that after David brings God's judgment upon Israel because of his sin of a census. Why would you count your people? Maybe the same way, why would you count your money? Yeah, so David fell into that common trap that rulers fall into. And so he sins against God by bringing a census. It's very interesting to read that if you have time, that David himself is convicted of the sin of the census, which is very different from when Nathan came to David and had to confront David in his blindness. But then David, as the shepherd king, is given three choices of how the judgment should come. And David chooses what you might not think would, if you could choose to have judgment that would come through a means, an intermediate source, or directly from God himself, which one would you choose? All right. There's some logic in thinking the intermediate source, because maybe there would be a diffusing of God's punishment against you. David, again, because we really need to think about David as the example. Maybe you should go to chapter 24. David does not want that. David wants it actually from Yahweh himself. And so David chooses that God himself would bring this plague against them. So verse 14, let us now fall into the hand of Yahweh, for his compassions are abundant, but do not let me fall into the hand of man. Do you think that way about God? Would you rather fall into his hand of judgment or into a man's hand for judgment? David knew God's compassions were always going to be mingled with his judgment and said, I would prefer God's hand to strike me down and not an intermediate. So he chooses the direct approach to God's punishment. But then, and this is really interesting, and this is a theme that really goes throughout the whole Bible, David now purchases a place that he may set up there an altar to make a sacrifice to God. And David himself, as the warrior king, now functions as a priest and offers a sacrifice to Yahweh for his sin, and Yahweh receives it and averts the wrath of God against his people. Yeah. Because here we have a king that Yahweh has anointed, who we see, and this is where you see the geography and the genealogy come together in the Davidic covenant and the son of David and Jerusalem, that there is now a union between the leader when it comes to defeating the enemies, but the leader also in directing right worship to Yahweh. David is that kind of king. David is that one that God appointed, and David is the king that God receives the sacrifice that averts his wrath against his people. And so one man wrote, David brought healing to his land by willingly suffering for his people, building a temple to offer a sacrifice that would avert God's punishment, and it was received by God and effective. Now tell me who that is a type of. Jesus Christ, that Davidic son who came into Jerusalem as the King of Israel and offered up himself, both the sacrifice and the high priest, and it averted the wrath of God. That he himself said that he would fall into the hand of Yahweh. And so here, Kevin, I see your hand, but here we are able to see that in that sense, we find fulfillment of so many of the promises, not in their fullness yet, but we find that here is a seed of woman who is bringing, in that sense, military, temporal, but in that sense, a salvation of God's people from their enemies. We see that he also is a shepherd kind of king. We also see that he is from the line of Judah, and he is a warrior king. His enemies are at his feet, and he is ruling over all the other tribes of Israel. So Genesis 49, 8 through 10 are fulfilled. We see even Hannah's prophecy being fulfilled in David. So in this case, it's sort of like all these rivers of expectation are streaming into Samuel, so that our focus and attention now is fixed upon David and his dynasty and what will happen in Jerusalem. So this is a book of Samuel. There's a lot more, lots of practical things. Like, this is a fantastic book for studying for practical benefit. If you were a preacher and you wanted to preach through an Old Testament book, Samuel preaches incredibly well. There's a lot of practical advice as well. So I have skipped over so much, and you can go back and read it for your own benefit. Kevin, you have a question.
So is David's sacrifice what Adam should have done?
Oh, I don't know. That's a good question. In one sense, we say no, because God's decree, in that sense, we know requires the fall so that God would redeem. Um,
But it's like,
yeah,
it's like the opposite of Christ.
Yeah.
Christ was the perfect atonement.
yeah,
Atonement. David is kind of like the transition to
yeah.
point to Christ.
Clearly, David knows that atonement is how sin is forgiven. We learn that in typological form in the garden, but it is not really developed until the Mosaic covenant. So it's a good question just to make you think. But I've never heard that question, and I surely don't have an answer for it. Tim, have you heard that?
I have not, but that's a great question.
Yeah. Has anybody heard that question and an answer? Read it anywhere? Yeah, great question. All right, thanks for enduring. Hopefully it was sound doctrine. You are dismissed.